Great. Welcome everyone to our May webinar. We're actually doing a re-record of this because we had some technical and physiological difficulties during the May session. So Joseph was kind enough to give his presentation again so that we could record it and host it on our YouTube channel. If you are not familiar with the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative, we are a network of organizations throughout the state of Ohio and regionally working together to advance bird conservation. So this is organizations that range from metro parks and state and federal wildlife agencies to NGOs like the Nature Conservancy and Audubon Society, universities, museums, any organization involved in the outdoors or avian conservation. We look for ways to work together on a lot of our efforts. If you are joining us and representing an organization somewhere in the state and you like what we do and are not a member of our organization, get in touch with us and you can find our contact info on obcinet.org. We have two upcoming webinars scheduled. So in July, on July 25th, we'll be hosting Aaron Skinner, who's currently a Fulbright scholar in Colombia, South America. He's a recent graduate from the Ohio State University with a master's degree, and his research looked at migratory connectivity of eastern whippoorwills. So they put GPS transmitters on whippoorwills to track them from breeding grounds here in Ohio through migration to their overwintering grounds. I was fortunate enough to help with some of the field work for that project. It's a really great study, and be sure to join us for that. And then in September, we have Carrie Morrow from Columbus and Franklin County Metro Parks, and she's going to be talking about a lot of the restoration work that they do within the park system. So if you work at a park system throughout Ohio or somewhere else, please join us. And Carrie's going to talk all about the great work that they do here in Central Ohio. You can sign up for those webinars on our website, obcinet.org, as well as watch archived webinars from years past. We've got dozens of webinars on our website, and those link to our YouTube channel. We're going to skip this because we have nobody here today with us to ask questions. And that leads us to today's presenter that I have to give double thanks again for essentially giving this presentation twice for us. So we're really happy to have Joseph Lautenbach from the Ohio Division of Wildlife. He's a wildlife biologist with DNR, and he's going to be talking about the ecology and management of grassland birds in Ohio. So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to Joseph so you can jump into this great presentation.
See that, Matt?
Yep, looks good.
All right, thanks for that introduction, Matt. And let's start talking about the ecology and management of grassland birds. We're going to focus primarily on Ohio, but you can't talk about the ecology without dipping into the literature that was collected in the Great Plains, which is the core grassland bird habitat in North America. So first, before we get too far into the presentation, we should define what a grassland is. I think most people intuitively know what a grassland is. However, we're going to define it anyways, just so we're all on the same page. So when we're talking about a grassland, we're talking about an open area that's dominated by herbaceous plants, and those are going to be especially, there's going to be an especially large component of grasses and grass-like plants, which could be sedges and rushes as well. Typically, there's also some forbs mixed in. Forbs are herbaceous flowering plants. They could be asters or clovers or goldenrod or any host of those herbaceous plants that you see in open areas that have flowers. So this would be a typical Midwestern grassland. So we can see that it's heavily dominated by grasses and grass-like plants. There are some forbs scattered through the grassland, and there are some trees in the background, but there's not extensive tree cover. There might be some small shrubs that are mixed in there that don't show up very well in this image, but that's a typical Midwestern grassland. So with that, now that we know what we're talking about when we're when we're referring to grasslands, we need to define what a grassland bird is. So typically when we're referring to grasslands, we're referring to these birds that rely on grasslands for at least one portion of their annual cycle. And there's lots of variety in these different grassland birds. We have songbirds, we have raptors, we have owls, shorebirds. There's a whole host and a wide variety of these different grassland birds. So typically we divide grassland birds into two groups: grassland generalists or facultative grassland birds, and grassland specialists or obligate grassland birds. So if we take a closer look at the grassland generalists first, or the facultative grassland birds, they're defined in one of the seminal works on grassland birds that was published in the late 90s as grassland specialists or facultative grassland birds use grasslands as part of a wider array of habitats. In general, these species are not entirely dependent on grasslands, but they use them commonly and regularly. So if we were to eliminate all of the grasslands in North America, species that are considered to be grassland generalists or facultative grassland birds would not go extinct. They would probably decline substantially, but they would still be present on the landscape. So when we're talking about grassland generalist birds in Ohio, what are we referring to? So here's some examples of grassland generalists. There's more than this. This is just a smattering. So we have, common yellowthroats up here, and then willow flycatchers, red-winged blackbirds. If you're familiar with red-winged blackbirds, they use wetlands, they use open lands, they use grasslands, they'll nest in ditches along the roads. But they need that open space component. Field sparrows, shrublands and open fields. Pheasants use a variety of open areas, but they also use shrublands. Brown-headed cowbirds, song sparrows, killdeer, you're going to find them more along shores or in more disturbed grasslands. Eastern kingbirds, shrikes. This is a northern shrike, but its close cousin, the loggerhead shrike, is also a facultative grassland bird, and the northern bobwhite quail. So grassland specialists or obligate grassland birds are species that are exclusively adapted to and entirely dependent on grassland habitats and make little or no use of other habitat types. That's how it was defined in that Vickery paper I referred to. So if you were to eliminate grasslands in North America, our grassland specialists would go extinct tomorrow. They would have no place to live. They're entirely dependent on grasslands. So if we're talking about grassland specialists in Ohio, we're talking about species like the eastern meadowlark, grasshopper sparrow, Henslow sparrow, dickcissel, upland sandpiper, bobolink, Savannah sparrow, horned lark, short-eared owl, and the northern harrier. There's others as well. These are just an example of a few. Some of them primarily overwinter in Ohio, like the northern harrier and the short-eared owl. Although they do breed in low numbers, they're not super common during the breeding season. And others breed primarily in Ohio and overwinter elsewhere, like the grasshopper sparrow and the Henslow sparrow. We can't talk about grassland birds without talking about their declines. Unfortunately, grassland birds have declined throughout their range. If we can remember that paper that came back out in 2019, talking about the birds that have declined in Ohio, or not in North America, excuse me, we saw that grassland birds declined more than any other group. So they're this one here way down at the bottom. Not only that, but if they've declined by more than 50%, which again is more than all these other different groups. And it's not happened to just a smattering of species that rely on grasslands in North America. Nearly 75% of our grassland birds in North America have undergone habitat, or well, they've lost habitat as well, but they've undergone population declines. So the primary cause for grassland bird declines in North America is habitat loss and degradation. What are we talking about? We're talking about habitat loss and degradation. Well, the most obvious example is where you convert native prairie to other sources of land use, like development or agricultural crops. So this is a picture that's taken in the Great Plains. And as you can see, we have this big extensive grassland. It was used maybe as part of a hayland. And then in a couple of years, it was converted to this crop field, and much less suitable for many grassland birds. In fact, it probably removed habitat for a number of them. While there would be some grassland birds that would use that bare ground and the row crop field, it's not as useful as a native function prairie. In Ohio, we didn't have extensive natural prairies. We did have some. They were never super extensive, and most of them were converted to row crops and other types of agricultural uses. Another source of habitat loss, especially in Ohio, is we converted. We became more agriculturally intense. We used to have a landscape that was very diverse, like this here in Clinton County. We can see this is where I-71 comes through, but we see there's lots of small fields, lots of crop diversity. Small grains are often used by many grassland birds, so small grains would mean oats or wheat or other things like that. There's probably some hay fields that served as grassland bird habitat. There's probably some pastures in here. I don't know exactly what all these different field types were. There's fence rows that provided grassland bird habitat for species like pheasants and quail and vesper sparrows. As agricultural, as we became more agriculturally intense as a society, we lost a lot of the small fields. So if we look at the same area and move forward 60 years to 2010, we can see that I-71 has come in here. We see that these are huge fields now, not the same type of cropland diversity. We pretty much have two field types now, soybeans and corn. A lot of the fence rows are gone, which would have created habitat for, again, those edge species like bobwhite quail and pheasants and vesper sparrows. So that's been probably the major driver of grassland bird declines in Ohio. Another thing that's driven grassland bird declines is forest maturation and forest succession. So if we look up here in Trumbull County, we can see we have the airport here. We have, lots of small fields, lots of fence rows, some woodlots, but not tons of them, some shrubland as well. If we move forward about 60 years, a comparable time frame is the last image, we can see that all these forests have grown up, and that has removed grassland bird habitat. If we look at these other areas here, in 2009, we can see this is an older stand of forest. We have pretty large fields. If we move back in time to 1952, we can see that these are indeed smaller fields with lots of fence rows providing habitat for a variety of grassland birds. And this is more shrubland here. Yeah, I think you all get the picture. And we can't talk about grasslands and grassland birds without talking about disturbance. So disturbance shapes grassland bird communities. Without disturbance, we get primarily those forested areas, especially in Ohio. It's less of an issue in the Great Plains, but even in the Great Plains where we have those extensive grasslands, they're experiencing conversion to forest in the native grasslands as well. So we're going to talk about three natural disturbance regimes first. I think the first thing most folks think of when they think of grasslands and disturbance is fire. So fire is what was and is a means to combat succession in grasslands. Here in Ohio, most of our fire now that we implement on the landscape through prescribed fire is done in the spring. Historically, it probably would have been in the late summer. We still use some fire in the summer, although it's less popular. When you burn in different times of seasons, you're going to get different results. Typically, if you're burning in March or April, you're going to have a lot hotter fire because you're going to be burning off that residual thatch and other debris. When you burn in the summer, you're going to have a less hot fire. It's going to be slower moving. You're going to impact species differently. So if you're managing a grassland, it's worth considering using different seasonal fire approaches in Ohio and throughout the Midwest. Another disturbance that shapes grasslands and grassland bird communities is grazing. Historically, it would have been bison and other large herbivores. Elk probably had some component in Ohio. However, throughout much of North America, cattle have replaced bison. However, they do mean, they don't graze identical to bison, but they do have similar traits. They mostly eat grasses. But grazing creates these different grazing lawns where you have, patches that are grazed pretty heavily. So it's shorter grass. Then you have other areas that are grazed less. And so you have taller grass in those areas, and it creates structural diversity on the landscape within that grassland. The other major driver is both precipitation and drought. So first of all, we have a precipitation gradient where as you move east to west, or west to east, you increase your precipitation. So we receive more precipitation here in Ohio, which is why we have more forest than we do in the panhandle of Nebraska, where we have, short grass prairie. And drought, if you have a really dry year, it's going to impact the vegetation differently, especially if you have a drought over a couple of years. So this image was taken in, would have been late May when I did the talk originally. As you can see, there's pretty extensive drought in the Southwest and in California and throughout much of the West, and that's going to impact vegetation and impact the structural diversity within that landscape, potentially for a couple years to come. As you have these different disturbances, you end up with a mosaic of different structural diversity through time. Ideally, you have a lot of that in the same grassland, especially if it's a large grassland. I'm going to talk about one more disturbance type that's not naturally occurring, but we can't talk about grasslands in Ohio if we don't talk about agriculture. So if we're talking about cropland, that's going to create lots of short open areas for grassland birds. Lots of birds will nest in wheat fields and other small grains. Haying, you're going through and you're removing the vegetation, and mowing is cutting off the vegetation but not removing it. It's not as natural as you would experience in a traditional naturally occurring grassland, but agriculture definitely influences grassland birds in Ohio and throughout North America. All right, now that we got all those different backgrounds on those different disturbances, let's talk about grassland disturbance and how it impacts birds. So if we look here on the bottom, we have 1 to 12 months or less than a year since a disturbance, and over here we go to greater than 3 years since a disturbance. So species like the Henslow sparrows are really queuing in on those areas that have greater time since disturbance, whether it's fire or mowing or grazing or whatever it is that you're looking at. Where if you go all the way to the other side of the spectrum, you have a species like the killdeer that's using these short grasses, more recently disturbed areas. You have species like the ringneck pheasant that use a whole gamut throughout the year because they're a resident game bird. So they like to nest in this thicker vegetation, but then they'll take their chicks into this more recently disturbed areas. Chicks of pheasants are quite small and they're precocial. So as soon as they hatch, they're leaving the nest. And if they can't navigate through this really dense vegetation that you see here, so the hens will usually take them to these more open areas. During the fall and the winter, they'll go feed in the crop fields, eating waste grain. So they're using those really recently disturbed areas. But they also like to have some dense cover to provide structure in the winter. Similarly, upland sandpiper like to nest in more dense grasses, but they like to forage in more open areas, and they like those forbs that provide the overhead cover for themselves and their chicks. And you have these other species that kind of target different areas in between. So as we can see, the structure really shapes the grassland bird communities. And there's been other research that shows that as you increase the structural diversity within a grassland, we see an increase in grassland bird diversity. So ideally, if you had a really large grassland, you'd want to try to provide a diverse mix of these different structures and time since disturbance to maximize grassland bird diversity. However, in some smaller grasslands, that may not be possible. So it's just important to make sure that you're disturbing the grassland through time and allowing those different species to come in as needed. If we take away disturbance in grasslands, what happens? I think everybody has seen it in Ohio. If you take away disturbance, we get forested. landscapes or shrublands. So this image was taken in the Red Hills of Kansas. Historically, this would have been wide open grasslands. There wouldn't have been very many trees out here, and they've taken fire out of the landscape in this area, and as a result, we see tree encroachment, and it's a big problem. Not only for grasslands, but it's also a problem for cattlemen because they're reducing the amount of forage available to their cattle. So, you know, if you had a big stand of these, well, of anything that produces lots of seeds, but in this image here, we have eastern red cedars. They produce lots of seeds. Birds like to eat these little seed-like berries or berry-like seeds. And they come out here and they poop, and then you get little sprouts, and that's how you get that's one way that these trees expand into grasslands. Eastern red cedar, if you have that as a problem when your grasslands, it's really easy to control. You just got to go through and burn it, and it'll kill those small seedlings. Other grass or other trees, you need to take more extensive measures, which we can get into in a little bit. But typically when we see an increase in woody encroachment or woody plant cover within a field, we see a decrease in grassland bird abundance, and we see a decrease in grassland bird diversity. For instance, on some reclaimed strip mine that we treated and removed autumn olive on, we saw a decreasing abundance as we increased the amount of woody cover within 200 meters. So that trend held true for eastern meadowlark, grasshopper sparrow, and Henslow sparrow. Similarly, as you increase woody plant density or woody plant cover, whatever metric you want to use, you see a decrease in grassland birds like the eastern meadowlark. This image here is taken from the southwest, and the verdin is a shrubland bird. You could do some other similar type thing here in Ohio with yellow-breasted chat, for instance. So as you get more woody plants, you see more yellow-breasted chats or verdins. So basically what happens is you see a conversion. You move from grassland species to shrubland and then eventually forest species. So here's an image from Woodbury Wildlife Area in 2004. It's a reclaimed surface mine. You can see that there are some trees in the area. But if you move forward about a decade, we see that we've had extensive expansion of woody plants, primarily autumn olive and honey locust and black locust on these grassland areas. And so we've gone through and we've applied herbicide to kill those trees, and then we've removed the standing dead vegetation and created new grassland habitat. So some species that are readily spreading in grasslands in Ohio include black locust, autumn olive, eastern red cedar. It's not as much of an issue here in Ohio, but in the Great Plains, it's a big problem. There's a number of other ones, Bradford pears, another species that I see a lot in grasslands that's expensive to control. There's a whole host of them. Yeah, so as you remove that woody vegetation and restore the grassland habitat, we see grassland bird abundance increase. Not only does the structure and the structural component of grasslands and disturbance impact grassland birds, but also the grassland shape and size. So here in these images, you can see that as you increase in grassland size, we see an increase in incidence of these grassland birds. So these different species respond differently. So for instance, grasshopper sparrows and upland sandpipers are probably the most area sensitive of these two, where you really need large grasslands to support those populations. If you kind of take away from a graphical and just look at these different sizes, we see, bobolinks. This is the same image that we saw before, just in a different representation. And so as you get the bigger grasslands, you're going to get more of these different grassland birds, like upland sandpiper. As grassland shape also varies, so you're going to have more grassland birds using this big block, less grassland birds using this, and this is probably going to be the least desirable grassland bird habitat. This would be the same amount of area in each one of these grasslands. It's just a different shape and that's going to impact the way that grassland birds use it. So for instance, as your patch size increases, or one negative consequence of having small grassland patches is you have increased rates of brood parasitism. So as you increase in brood, as you increase in patch size, you see a decrease in brood parasitism by the brown-headed cowbirds, which has reproductive consequences for grassland birds. And while this trend isn't consistent across the range, typically you'll also see an increase in nest predation as you increase or as you decrease in patch size. Oh yeah, so as you increase patch size, we decrease brood parasitism rates. Also, the grassland landscape has an important context for grassland bird use. So this landscape here, if you were looking at one of these little patches, you'd be more likely to have a grassland bird species using this one because there's lots more grassland total in the landscape as opposed to this, which is the exact same size. There's a lot less grassland habitat on the landscape for those grassland birds to use. We can also look at invasive plant species. So invasive plant species and introduced plant species often impact the grassland communities. So for instance, a species like Sericea lespedeza, which is a form that was introduced to control erosion. As we increase the amount of Sericea lespedeza on the landscape, we see a decrease in other plant abundance and plant diversity as well. That has consequences because as we have more monocultures or areas that are similar with one plant species, we see a decrease in insect abundance, and insects are the base of a lot of the bird food chains. And so there's a chance that you could be negatively impacting bird populations. However, that is difficult to test, and I don't know if it's been tested effectively in grassland birds. So some invasive and introduced plants that we see in grasslands in Ohio include smooth brome and tall fescue, which are both grasses that were introduced for erosion control and as pasture grasses. Sericea lespedeza, teasel, Canada thistle, there's many others, but that's just a smattering. If we take a deeper dive into tall fescue, which can be invasive, but it's introduced widely for, it's probably growing in your lawn at home, it's probably growing in your neighbor's pasture. It's probably growing on the roadside because it's effective at reducing erosion, and but it's not a great structural diverse plant, or it's not a great structural plant for grassland birds. And we're going to take a closer look at this one. So as you increase the amount of tall fescue in the landscape, you see increased predation rates of grasshopper sparrow nests. And if you look at dig thistle nest survival, you see a decreased daily nest survival rate when you have an increase in tall fescue within 5 meters of the nest. So this non-native plant is reducing the reproductive capacity of 2 grassland birds, but perhaps more. This is the only 2 species that I was able to find information on regarding invasive plant species, just because it's difficult to investigate at times. So in general, invasive plant species can reduce the grassland bird diversity and grassland plant diversity, and there's a chance that they could reduce abundance of grassland birds. They definitely reduce the abundance of native grassland plants. We're still learning about this stuff, but in general, removing invasive species is often a win-win solution for both landowners and birds. So for instance, if you're grazing a reclaimed surface mine and people planted a bunch of, or the reclamation efforts included lots of different non-native plants like Sericea lespedeza. If you can remove that Sericea lespedeza, you're going to increase the amount of forage for your cattle, and you're also going to probably improve the quality of that grassland for grassland birds. In terms of grassland management, it's important to maintain our existing grasslands, especially if we can focus on our large grasslands. If we're working on maintaining those grasslands, we should try to reduce the amount of edge and fragmentation within them. If we're focused on creating habitat for grassland specialists that require, larger grasslands, perhaps it makes sense to remove some of the trees that are in the middle, just to provide better overall habitat. If we have a patchwork of large grasslands, trying to connect those more and provide connectivity among those areas to provide a larger, that would be connecting a bunch of small grasslands to make an effectively larger grassland would be a good strategy. In general, if we see a diverse grassland in terms of both plant species and the structural diversity, we're going to see a more diverse grass and bird community. So if it's possible to provide a structural diversity within your large grassland, you're going to provide more habitat for a larger suite of birds. And if one of your species that you're interested in managing for is the ringneck pheasant or the bobwhite quail, you're going to create, you'll be able to create all the different types of grass that they need throughout the year. So you have some denser grass for overwinter survival and nest placement in the spring. And then you have some more open areas where they can forage with their chicks, for instance. Typically in Ohio, we need to disturb our grasslands every 2 to 3 years. 3 years might even be a stretch. I was looking at some grasslands that were recently disturbed, or even they were recently planted to a new mix, and there's already black locust growing in there that's 4 or 5 feet tall, and it was planted just 2 years ago. So you really, if you're managing your grassland, you really need to be disturbing it every year or every other year, at most every 3 years, to try to keep that woody plant component out of the grasslands. And you can use fire in the spring or in the summer or in the winter or whenever it works. You're going to get different responses from the vegetation depending on when that fire is applied. You could mow your grassland, you could mow strips, you can mow half of the grass, and we're going to get into some different management techniques in just a minute, but mowing is definitely a technique that you can use, or haying. You can introduce some grazing component into your grassland just to create some structural diversity. You're still going to need to incorporate some sort of fire or mowing or something in order to combat that woody plant encroachment issue in the grassland, because cattle don't always eat trees. So typically, if you're going to be burning in the spring, you should try to apply that fire before April 15. After April 15, you start to get, bobwhite quail and pheasant nests, and you're going to have other birds coming in and settling in those areas and starting to lay nests. So that's a way to reduce the impact on the reproductive success of grassland birds by putting your fire earlier in the year. Delay your fire and your mowing in the summer until at least July 15, ideally August 1st, to allow those nests to complete and to reduce the impact on those birds that have recently fledged. If you can mow from the inside out of your pasture, you're gonna push the birds and other animals out of the field, as opposed to like shrinking the amount of habitat that they have and reducing the direct fatality to those birds and mammals. You could break your large fields into multiple units so you have some sort of structural diversity on the landscape. What does that look like? Say you have an 80-acre pasture or field. You break it into 2 40-acre sections, for instance, and you burn it in year 1 on this side, and then you wait till the year 2 to burn it there, or you mow this half in year 2, and the next year you mow this half. You can break it down even further into 3 different patches, so you have structural diversity across 3 different years. I remember what I was talking about with this one. So yeah, good news. Grassland restoration works. So if we put grass on the landscape, we see birds using those different areas. One big source of grassland in the last 2 decades, or since the late 1980s, has been the Conservation Reserve Program, which is a federal program that pays farmers to take agricultural lands out of production. And it's been a great success story for grassland birds. So for instance, here's the Henslow sparrow. The national trends of this species was declining. 1985, the Farm Bill signed, CRP grasslands start to pop up across the eastern United States, which is the core of the Henslow sparrow's range. And we see the population recover. And then we see a big decline in CRP acreage starting in around 2008. And we see the species decline again. So by putting all that grassland habitat on the landscape, we saw species like the Henslow sparrow start to increase and reverse the decline. And once those CRP acres started to come out, we saw the decline begin to occur again. So this is just for Ohio, and we see the same trend where we have decreasing Henslow sparrow population, and then increasing as the Farm Bill came on, and then starting to decrease as we lose grassland acres starting around 2000. So this is an image of CRP acres in the USA from 1986 through 2019. And we can see that CRP peaked in 2008 across the United States, and we've seen a slow, steady decline. So something that everybody can do for grassland bird conservation is talk to your legislatures and your senators and advocate for a strong conservation programs within the Farm Bill. The current Farm Bill expires next year in 2023. So start talking to your legislatures and your representatives and your senators and telling them that you think it's important to have a strong conservation entitlements and practices built into the Farm Bill, because not only does it benefit birds, but it also benefits, it improves, there's other benefits to having CRP on the landscape. We see increased water, blanking on the word. We see increased water filtration. We see, flood reduction. There's all kinds of benefits for having CRP on the landscape. Something else that's coming on that's becoming more popular with farmers is precision agriculture. And basically what it does is it tries to find places on the farm that are not as productive and enroll them into conservation programs like the CRP, or convert areas into wetlands and get payment there. And so basically you're trying to find areas that are poor productivity and finding a way to make those acres make you money through other methods other than farming. With that, I think that's it. I don't know if there's any questions, because this is just me and Matt. That's all I got.
Thanks, Joseph. Yeah, that was great. Thanks for doing that again. I did think of a couple questions, which I think people will be interested in, if you don't mind entertaining me for a couple minutes.
Sure.
So as you kind of concluded there, the CRP and CREP programs have been really amazing for ensuring habitat for grassland birds on the landscape. And that's, primarily directed at folks who are farming the landscape. And I know there are maybe some people who are becoming increasingly interested in utilizing controlled fire on their property, potentially if they're really managing it exclusively for wildlife. Are there any resources available now, or if a private landowner is interested in burning their fields, how do they go about looking into that or getting assistance and moving forward with that?
Don't know if there's any of these in Ohio, but there are prescribed fire groups where you get together with other landowners and you fill out all the paperwork together and you plan your burns that way. There are private contractors that do prescribed fires. It does cost a little bit of money. I don't know what their costs are now. You might reach out to your local Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever chapter, as they often provide that service to folks because they're interested in Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever are very interested in maintaining grassland and upland habitats on the landscape, and they often help with those kinds of activities.
Perfect, thank you. And the other one I thought of that I had asked when we attempted to do this live last month was regarding climate change and sort of coordinated management of grassland birds. With various climate change models predicting drier climates, more drought, and that not only changes the microhabitat, but we've seen sort of larger landscape scale movements for some of the species with respect to drought. I know like dickcissel and bobolink, for instance, have sort of made sort of larger movements. So I wonder within any of the migratory bird joint ventures, or do you work within the flyway or other state agencies to look at sort of grassland habitat on the landscape, and are there any sort of adaptive climate change management plans going on right now?
I don't know about adaptive climate change management plans, but there's definitely a lot of interest in having coordinated efforts among states and regions and flyways to conserve grassland birds. And if you're providing this diverse grasslands across the country, that should allow for birds to move to where the types of grasslands that they need for the year, based on the conditions on the landscape, if that makes sense.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I think that's all we have for questions for today. So yeah, again, thank you for doing this a second time around. I think it's a really important topic, and a lot of folks will be really interested to see this on our YouTube channel. So thanks again. And as a quick reminder, we do have upcoming webinars in July and September. So visit our website, obcinet.org, and sign up for those. So thanks, Joseph.
Yep, thank you.